A racist police officer attacks a black veteran in broad daylight, assuming the incident would once again be covered up like so many times before. But he didn't expect that the veteran's son would have the strength to overthrow the entire system. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you care about justice and accountability, don't forget to like and subscribe for more meaningful stories like this. The afternoon sunlight shone down on the small town, casting a golden hue over the familiar streets that Marcus Brooks had walked countless times in his life. At 68 years old, Marcus was a calm but resolute man. Known as a respected black veteran, he had fought and spent his life afterward serving the community. Although elderly, he still held a straight posture and a dignified demeanor that many admired. To the townspeople, Marcus was a symbol of resilience and kindness. That afternoon, he had just left the Veterans Hall, where he had spent a few hours chatting with old friends about memories and war stories, and reminiscing about comrades lost. It was a peaceful afternoon, the kind Marcus loved, where time seemed to slow down, allowing him to savor each gentle, tranquil moment. As he walked into the town square, something unusual made Marcus pause. In the distance, near a park bench, a small crowd had gathered and was gradually growing larger. He squinted, trying to understand what was happening. Amid the crowd, a large, intimidating man stood out with an unfriendly face. It was Roger Ebert, the police officer whose name everyone in town knew, but whom few held in high regard. Roger was infamous for his violent methods and was often rumored to harbor racial biases, especially against black people and teenagers. Many had endured tense moments when forced to confront him, and even the elderly often tried to steer clear of trouble when they saw Roger on duty. In front of Roger stood a young man who appeared to have just reached adulthood, with eyes full of worry and fear. He stood rigid, clearly uneasy under Roger's menacing gaze. His hand trembled as he tried to retrieve something from his jacket pocket. The crowd around them stood silent, no one daring to step closer or speak up. A few looked ready to leave to avoid getting entangled in trouble, but no one dared to intervene. Marcus sighed and, with the instincts of a man who had faced battles, decided to approach to see if he could help. He couldn't leave the young man stranded when it was clear he was in a difficult spot. As Marcus drew near, he spoke in a calm yet powerful voice. "Is everything all right, officer?" Roger immediately turned, his cold gaze locking onto Marcus. "This isn't your business, Brooks," Roger replied, his tone curt and arrogant. "You'd best be on your way." Marcus was unfazed by Roger's cold words. Instead, he held his gaze gently, patiently watching the frightened young man. Finally, the young man managed to pull an ID card from his pocket, his hand shaken as he handed it to Roger. Roger snatched the card from him, glancing at it briefly before shoving it back in his pocket with no respect. Marcus's voice remained calm but firm. "I was just passing by. This young man doesn't seem to be causing any trouble." Roger's face darkened, his eyes clouded with a growing anger. In Roger's mind, Marcus's presence, a calm, respectful older man, was a direct challenge to his authority. He stepped closer to Marcus, intentionally using his large frame to intimidate him. "Mr. Marcus, I said this isn't your business," Roger said, lowering his voice menacingly. "I suggest you step away before you bring trouble upon yourself." Marcus didn't back down. He stood tall, his gaze fixed on Roger, and spoke gently yet resolutely. "I've seen situations like this before, Roger, and I know when things are about to go bad. This young man doesn't seem to be causing any trouble." Roger's face twisted from anger to hostility, and with the crowd watching, he felt his authority severely challenged. The people around them hesitated, the atmosphere growing tense, like a taut string on the verge of snapping. Marcus held his ground, standing firm. There's no need for violence here. This young man hasn't done anything wrong. Letting him go is the best option. These words seemed to pour gasoline on the fire. Roger's expression contorted in rage, and unable to contain himself, he swung a powerful fist, striking Marcus squarely in the face. The blow was so strong that Marcus staggered, losing his balance and falling backward. His body hit the ground hard with a loud thud, and his head struck the concrete with a painful crack. Blood began to seep from the back of Marcus's head, forming a small pool beneath him. The surrounding crowd was stunned, unable to believe their eyes. At that moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, suddenly, people near Marcus rushed over to help him, while many others quickly pulled out their phones to record the shocking scene. Roger stood motionless, his face pale, his eyes wide with horror as he realized he had gone too far. In the thick, tense air, a few people shouted for help, and a woman quickly called an ambulance. Marcus lay motionless, while Roger, with a face full of confusion and tension, looked around in distress, realizing that all eyes in the crowd were on him, eyes filled with anger and shock. Shortly after the horrifying scene of Roger Ebert's blow was captured and went viral, the entire town seemed to fall into a state of shock. Videos showing Marcus Brooks, a well-respected veteran, lying motionless on the ground, blood seeping from his head, quickly surfaced on social media. Townspeople buzzed with discussions, community groups rapidly shared updates, and outrage erupted. Marcus was not just an elderly man. He was a symbol of resilience and kindness, someone whom everyone cherished and respected. Calls for justice echoed everywhere. Just hours after the incident, hashtags like Justice for Marcus and End Police Violence began trending widely on Twitter and Facebook, drawing the attention of thousands both within and outside the town. Civil rights groups quickly mobilized, organizing spontaneous protests in front of the police station where Roger worked. The community held banners reading Justice for Marcus and No Place for Police Violence. A tense and stifling atmosphere pervaded the town. During this time, Jacob Brooks, Marcus's only son and the state attorney general, appeared. He received news of his father's condition through an emergency call while at his office. Jacob, a resolute and steadfast man, had dedicated his career to the pursuit of justice. But this time the story had become intensely personal. He was not only an attorney, he was also a grieving son determined to seek justice for his father. The unwavering look in Jacob's eyes as he stepped out of his office made it clear to his colleagues and subordinates that this time he would not back down. Jacob began investigating the incident immediately. He contacted those present at the scene, gathered witness testimonies, and requested reports from the police department. But, as he delved into the investigation, he realized uncovering the truth would be no simple task. The local police department, where Roger worked, was known for its lack of transparency and shadowy practices. Police report about the incident painted Marcus as a troublemaker, attempting to twist the narrative to protect Roger. Jacob understood he was not only up against a corrupt cop, but an entire system that had long enabled wrongdoing. While fully immersed in his investigation, Jacob received a call from an unknown number. A low, steady voice introduced itself. "I'm Elijah Thompson, an officer from the department. I have information on Roger Ebert and his misconduct, but I can't discuss this at the station. If you want to know more, meet me at the cafe near the park tonight. I believe this is something you need to hear." Jacob was surprised, but didn't hesitate. His determination and desire to expose injustice compelled him to agree right away. That night, he arrived at the cafe and spotted Elijah, a young police officer, sitting in a secluded corner. Elijah's face appeared tense, but his eyes showed resolve. "Thank you for coming," Jacob said, sitting down across from Elijah. Elijah gave a slight nod, then discreetly took a thick file from his bag and placed it on the table. "Everything you need to know is in here," Elijah said, his voice quiet but firm. "These are internal reports about Roger and several other officers. Numerous complaints against Roger have been overlooked or fabricated to hide his misconduct. He's been warned before, but never disciplined seriously." Jacob opened the file, skimming through pages filled with reports and internal notes. Some pages were old, with complaints from years back about Roger's excessive use of force, especially against minority communities. "Why did you decide to give me this information?" Jacob asked, his gaze both questioning and grateful. Elijah sighed, his expression laced with sorrow and anger. "I joined the police force to protect and serve this community, but what I've witnessed here has left me disillusioned. Roger and some other officers have turned this place into a tool of violence and injustice. Marcus was an honorable man and he didn't deserve this. I can't stay silent any longer." Jacob silently looked at Elijah, understanding that this young man was also grappling with inner conflict. A young officer, caught between loyalty to his peers and his conscience, had ultimately chosen to stand on the side of justice. Elijah was a rare beacon of integrity in a corrupted police system. "Thank you, Elijah. This will be immensely helpful," Jacob said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I promise to use all of this to bring the truth to light." They sat for a while longer, discussing the details in the file. Elijah shared additional stories of Roger's abuse of power, coercing the vulnerable into submission, and how other colleagues had often witnessed it but remained silent to protect their jobs. Jacob listened intently, each detail strengthening his resolve. As they left the cafe, Jacob felt he was no longer alone in this fight. Elijah had become an unexpected ally, someone brave enough to confront the corruption within his ranks. With the documents Elijah had provided, Jacob knew this was only the beginning of a much larger investigation. And this time, he wasn't only targeting Roger Ebert, but an entire system that had shielded and enabled such misconduct. Stepping outside, the streetlights cast long shadows across their faces. Elijah turned to Jacob, his voice serious. "Be careful, Jacob. Not everyone in the department will be pleased to see you digging into this." Jacob gave a slight nod, knowing that what lay ahead would be difficult and dangerous. But with the evidence he had just obtained, Jacob believed he was ready to face any challenge to reclaim justice for his father. Both men left the cafe in silence but filled with determination. Elijah returned to the station, preparing to confront the risks of his colleagues. Meanwhile, Jacob held the file tightly, a powerful record of the decay within a system meant to uphold justice. The battle had only just begun, and Jacob knew the road ahead would be tough. But with a hidden ally and invaluable information in hand, he believed he truly had a chance to expose the truth and seek justice for his honorable father. When Jacob Brooks returned to his office the next morning, his mind was in turmoil with the documents Elijah had provided and the warnings about cover-ups within the police department. Realizing that his father had not only fallen victim to a violent police officer, but to a corrupted system, Jacob was determined not only to seek justice for his father, but also to expose the truth about a deeply flawed institution. Jacob immediately requested all reports and records related to Roger Ebert, but the police department responded defensively and even obstructed his request. At that moment, Jacob realized he was facing a wall built to shield the truth, erected by those who did not want their secrets exposed. Undeterred, he took stronger measures. As Attorney General, he sent an official request to the court, compelling the police department to provide complete and unaltered records regarding Roger's cases. When the files finally arrived at Jacob's office, he quickly noticed something was wrong. The reports provided by the department were brief, with few details, or altered to the point of being empty, with no trace of complaints. The allegations of Roger's violence appeared to have vanished entirely. One late afternoon, as he reviewed the documents in frustration, Jacob received a call from an anonymous source. The shaky, anxious voice on the other end said, "Mr. Brooks, I work in the police department, and there's something you need to know. They're deliberately erasing old reports about Roger. The original records have been altered or replaced with new ones that omit his violent conduct." Jacob fell silent, sensing the truth was being systematically concealed. "Who's behind this?" he asked. But before he could hear more, the caller hastily hung up, leaving him with a slew of unanswered questions. Unable to let this slide, Jacob filed a request for a search warrant for the police department to locate the original records. The court quickly approved the warrant, and that evening, he and a team of investigators arrived at the police department to inspect its records system. As he entered the archives room, Jacob couldn't ignore the tense stares from the surrounding officers. They knew their secrets were at risk of exposure. After hours of meticulous searching, Jacob's team found evidence of the deletion or falsification of significant reports related to Roger. Among them were records of violent incidents he had committed, particularly against minority communities. These files showed that Roger had been reported multiple times, but, for unknown reasons, the complaints had either been dismissed or not addressed. The truth was becoming clearer, but also more complex. Jacob discovered that it wasn't just Roger. Several high-ranking officials in the police department were involved in covering up for him. The initial reports bore the signatures of senior officers, clearly indicating a network that protected and concealed these wrongful acts. Another late night, as Jacob sat in his office analyzing the evidence he had gathered, his phone rang again. Elijah's voice was tense. "Jacob, I just heard they're planning to destroy the archived files on Roger and the involved officers to eliminate all evidence. They want to act tonight." Realizing this could be the last chance to stop the cover-up, Jacob quickly assembled a team of investigators and rushed to the police department. Upon arrival, he demanded access to the record system, this time under court supervision. Carefully, Jacob and the investigators checked every corner of the archives room and the internal computer systems. When they examined the hard drives, they discovered that many crucial documents had been deleted or moved within the system. With the assistance of technology experts, Jacob and his team began the process of recovering the deleted files. The experts quickly restored some of the older records, which contained numerous complaints about Roger that the police department had intentionally erased. The recovered evidence displayed a clear pattern of violent behavior and abuse of power spanning many years. While the investigators and specialists continued restoring files, Jacob took time to speak with some employees at the station, those who might have witnessed or known about the plan to destroy evidence. A few, initially hesitant but later pressured by the investigation, gradually admitted that they had received orders from senior officials to ignore or even participate in covering up Roger's actions. Over the following days, Jacob and his team worked tirelessly. and each new piece of evidence helped him gradually piece together the full picture of a police system that not only protected Roger, but also itself. The documents clearly showed connections among several officers, revealing that Roger's abuse of power had been knowingly tolerated by those in higher positions. A long history of misconduct, from wrongful arrests to unchecked violence, all protected by this network. The deeper Jacob delved into the investigation, the more he recognized the complexity and scale of this protective system. Roger's actions were not just the failings of one individual, but a symptom of a police force that had lost its integrity. This wasn't simply a case of police brutality. It was a battle against an entire system that enabled and defended injustice. This fight would be long and arduous, but Jacob was unwavering. With increasingly compelling evidence in his hands, he knew he would bring the truth to light, not just for his father, but for all the others who had been victims of this police system. His resolve grew stronger than ever. He would not allow anyone to suffer as his father had, unprotected and without justice. As the truth about Roger Ebert's misconduct gradually came to light, the community was no longer just a group of witnesses. They had become warriors for justice. The image of Marcus Brooks, the town's beloved veteran, lying motionless on the ground after Roger's brutal blow had become a symbol of the injustice everyone was determined to fight against. Videos and articles about the attack were rapidly shared across social media, capturing not only the town's attention but igniting a wave of outrage nationwide. Major media outlets from across the country flocked to the town to report on the story, making the community's quest for justice a national focal point. Articles, news broadcasts, and television reports elevated Marcus's case into a pressing social issue. Numerous justice advocates, civil rights organizations, and even prominent politicians began to speak out, demanding accountability from the police department and calling for systemic reforms. Jacob Brooks led the investigation. Every day, he tirelessly worked to gather more evidence and dig deeper into the police department, determined to expose the truth about the wall of protection that had been built around Roger. Yet, what kept Jacob steadfast was not just his career or responsibility, but the love and respect he held for his father. During late nights in his quiet office, when the city had fallen asleep, Jacob often recalled childhood memories with his father, the man who had always taught him about integrity, courage, and responsibility. He remembered one night, as a young boy, when Marcus sat beside him, sharing stories of his time in the military. "Jacob, courage isn't just standing up to enemies, it's facing injustice, even if it hurts you," Marcus said thoughtfully. "You must always do what's right, even if you stand alone." Thinking of his father's words, Jacob felt a profound sense of resolve. His father was not just a parent, but a shining example of honesty and bravery. Now, as Marcus lay in a hospital bed, teetering between life and death, Jacob understood that he was fighting not only for justice, but to uphold the values his father had instilled in him. One late evening, after a long day filled with meetings and preparations for legal proceedings, Jacob decided to visit his father in the hospital. Walking into the room, the scene pained him deeply. Marcus lay there, motionless, surrounded by life support machines. Despite being in a deep sleep, his face retained the resolute look of a soldier, proud even in his vulnerability. Jacob sat beside him, took his father's hand, and whispered in the silence, "Dad, I won't stop. I will fight to the end. Not just for you, but for everyone who needs justice." Jacob's struggle was no longer just a duty of an attorney general. It had become a personal journey, bolstered by the support and encouragement of the community and cherished memories of his father. Each time he attended a rally or watched hundreds of townspeople chant "Justice for Marcus," he felt the unbreakable strength of unity. Under growing pressure from the community and media attention, the police department was forced to hold a press conference to address the allegations. Jacob was there, seated in the front row, facing the police officials. The tense expressions on the faces of senior officials subtly betrayed their anxiety as they confronted the public's anger. Reporters' questions came in rapid succession, probing into the lack of transparency and the years-long cover-ups by the police department. After the officials attempted vague and evasive explanations, Jacob was invited to speak. He stood up, his face calm but his gaze unwavering. His voice rang out clearly and firmly. "Our community has endured far too long the lack of transparency and misconduct from those who were meant to protect us. My father, Marcus Brooks, was not just the victim of one officer abusing his power. He was the victim of an entire corrupt system. I stand here today not only to seek justice for my father, but to demand a comprehensive reform that will protect every citizen in this town." Jacob's words stirred the entire press conference. The people and journalists in attendance couldn't hold back their applause and cheers of support. His resolve inspired and ignited hope in everyone present, further solidifying their determination to demand justice for Marcus and reform in the police system. After the press conference, Jacob returned to his office. On his desk lay a multitude of papers and reports awaiting attention, yet he did not feel weary. The faith and support of the community had become a powerful driving force, helping him push through. In the days that followed, Jacob and his legal team continued working tirelessly to gather more evidence and dig deeper into the police department's internal misconduct. The information and evidence they uncovered revealed that Roger Ebert was not an isolated case. Other officers had also abused their power over the years. Meanwhile, the town's protests continued to grow. Residents who had endured injustice and silence now found their voices. They gathered in front of the police station daily, holding signs calling for reform and relentlessly increasing pressure on the legal system. Civil rights organizations joined the effort, supporting the town's fight for justice and providing lawyers and necessary resources to protect their rights. One night after finishing his work, Jacob once again visited his father in the hospital. The room was so quiet that only the steady hum of machines and Marcus's gentle breathing could be heard. Jacob sat by his father's bedside, holding his hand, and whispered, "Dad, this fight is no longer just mine. The whole town is standing up for you and themselves. They're fighting for justice, for a better future." In that silence, Jacob felt as though his father was listening. He understood that Marcus's teachings were more than words. They were core values that had shaped his life. Jacob's battle was now about more than protecting his father. It was about upholding and spreading the noble values Marcus had lived by and passed down. The community's unity, the strong backing of advocacy organizations, and Jacob's determination had forged a solid movement. The fight for justice for Marcus Brooks was no longer just about one man. It had become a symbol for change. With each passing day, Jacob knew he was drawing closer to the ultimate goal, a fair and transparent justice system where no one would suffer unjustly and senselessly at the hands of violence. Along this path, Jacob knew he was never alone. His father was with him, and the community stood behind him, all marching together on the journey to bring truth to light. As Jacob's investigation progressed and evidence was gradually revealed to the public, Roger Ebert realized that the power and influence he once took pride in had faded. Now he was left alone, facing a flood of accusations and the fury of the community, those who once supported and shielded him within the police department had now distanced themselves. The protection the system once afforded Roger was gone, and he felt himself being pushed to the fringes. More troubling for Roger was the indifference of Police Chief Adam. As public outrage grew, Adam began to realize that he could no longer protect Roger, and that he himself might be held accountable for years of condoning Roger's misconduct. Under pressure from the media, mounting protests, and the accumulating evidence Jacob's team had gathered, Adam knew that defending Roger had become impossible. In desperation, Roger sought out Chief Adam, pleading for help. "You can't just abandon me. We've worked together for years." Roger's voice was rough with anger and fear, but Adam only shook his head, avoiding Roger's eyes. "Things have changed, Roger. We can't go on as we did before. I tried my best to protect you, but now we're cornered. To survive this, I have to save myself." Feeling betrayed and abandoned, Roger grew increasingly panicked. His resentment swelled, but his fear was greater. He knew he had to find another way out of the trap he'd set for himself. Together with a few remaining allies in the police department, Roger began to hatch a dangerous plan to flip the narrative, recasting himself as the victim. Their plan relied on fabricated evidence to construct a story that Marcus had attacked Roger first. If they could convince the public and the court that Roger acted in self-defense, he could avoid charges and frame the case as a complex incident, casting doubt on the truth. To reinforce the plan, Adam contacted a well-known lawyer famous for handling high-profile cases and skilled at turning cases around. The lawyer agreed to take on the case, but only if Adam and Roger could provide sufficient evidence to support their version of events. In secret meetings with Adam and his remaining allies, Roger and his team meticulously planned to alter videos and incident reports. They used footage from other cases, editing and splicing it to make Marcus appear aggressive. They also created false reports, documenting that Marcus had allegedly provoked and threatened Roger from the start. One night, after the police station lights had gone out and no one was around, Roger and his accomplices sneaked into the archives to replace original documents with the altered reports. The footage was manipulated, and witness statements were changed to fit their fabricated story. Roger hoped that with enough forged evidence and the defense of a renowned lawyer, he might have a chance to turn the tables, escape the charges, and preserve his reputation. However, this scheme could not deceive Jacob. From the start, he sensed irregularities in the newly provided police records. Some reports and videos looked too polished, lacking the natural details that eyewitnesses had previously mentioned. Drawing on his extensive experience, Jacob suspected tampering. He knew that to dismantle this conspiracy he needed indisputable proof of document falsification. Jacob decided to contact Elijah, the young officer who had been secretly assisting him. Aware of the risks, Elijah agreed to provide the original documents he had discreetly saved before they were replaced. He handed over these materials to Jacob, including unaltered footage and the original incident reports from the day of the attack. As Jacob delved deeper into the records, he saw the fabrications that Adam and Roger had constructed. The edited videos didn't align with witness testimonies, and the timestamps didn't match the actual timing of the event. Additionally, witnesses confirmed that Marcus had not acted aggressively. He had merely intervened when he saw Roger threatening a young man in the park. Meanwhile, the community grew stronger and more unified. The protests had now become an unstoppable force. Not only the town's residents, but also civil rights groups from other states joined in, demanding truth and justice for Marcus. The unity of the people had become a powerful force, fighting not only for Marcus but for a cleaner justice system. Unable to avoid it any longer, the police department was forced to hold a press conference to address the allegations. Before hundreds of reporters and town residents, Adam tried to maintain his composure, though he was nervous. Jacob sat in the front row, his sharp gaze fixed on the police officials. When it was Adam's turn to speak, he attempted vague justifications, but questions from the press about the altered records, edited videos, and conflicting witness statements quickly exposed the lies. Finally, Jacob was invited to the podium. His voice rang out strong and clear. "We have gathered sufficient evidence to prove that Roger Ebert was not only a violent officer, but part of a cover-up orchestrated by those in power. Fabricated evidence cannot replace the truth, and today we stand here to demand justice." Jacob's words left the room in silence, followed by thunderous applause from the community. The people's anger intensified as they saw how the truth had been systematically twisted. Shortly after the press conference, Adam and Roger's falsified evidence was revealed to the public, leading Adam to submit his resignation. Roger, completely despondent, realized that his time was up and that he would have to face justice. Out on the streets, protests continued, but now they resounded with victorious cheers. People believed that justice was finally within reach and that the system was beginning to change. The community's solidarity had become a force for exposing corruption and defending the values they cherished. Jacob knew the fight was far from over, but with determination and the community's support, he would continue on the path to bring the truth to light. The final trial had arrived, and Jacob Brooks stood in the courtroom, his determined eyes fixed on the defendant, Roger Ebert, who had caused tragedy for his father and instilled terror in the community. This was not merely a trial for an individual, but the beginning of a transformation of a corrupt police system. Under the watchful eyes of the community and the press, Jacob felt the weight of responsibility but also the hope. He knew time was ticking, and every piece of evidence had to be presented promptly to prevent the case from being dismissed. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Jacob and his team worked around the clock. The evidence against Roger needed to be meticulously gathered and organized, leaving no loophole for Roger's lawyer to exploit. The urgency of time constantly reminded Jacob that if he didn't proceed promptly, the case risked being prolonged or even dismissed due to political pressure and hidden forces trying to sway the outcome. As the trial began, the courtroom was packed with townspeople who had endured and fought to be there, eager to see the truth revealed. They hoped for real change. They had come to witness Roger being brought into the light, to hear the public accusations of his violence and the system's cover-up. Everyone understood that this trial was not just about prosecuting a single officer, but marked the beginning of justice for all silent victims. Jacob started by presenting the case with a strong, resolute voice, each word echoing through the courtroom. "Your Honor, we are here today not only to prosecute Roger Ebert for the brutal assault on Mr. Marcus Brooks, but also to expose years of abuse of power, cover-ups, and systemic protection that have shielded him." He laid out each piece of evidence, from videos of the assault to the reports that Roger and his associates had tried to falsify. Every piece of evidence was scrutinized, and every witness statement was carefully considered. The documents, secretly provided by Elijah, the unaltered videos, and testimonies from honest witnesses painted a clear picture of Roger's actions and the deception of those behind him. On the other side, Roger's defense lawyer argued that Marcus had been the aggressor and that Roger had acted in self-defense. But, with the careful preparation of Jacob and his team, these arguments were quickly refuted. Witnesses came forward, truthfully recounting that Marcus had shown no aggression and that it was Roger who had attacked him without justification. Roger's fabricated story couldn't withstand the weight of authentic evidence and the truth of the witnesses. A sense of urgency and tension gripped everyone as the trial continued. Jacob knew he had to remain steadfast, unshaken by the tricks of Roger's defense. He presented further evidence of Roger's past misconduct, including cases of excessive force and concealed or altered reports that had shielded him from accountability. This evidence revealed a long-standing pattern of abuse of power that the system had attempted to hide for years. As the trial reached its climax, the community outside continued to show their support for Jacob and his family. Protests were ongoing outside the courthouse, with hundreds gathered, holding banners demanding justice for Marcus and calling for system reform. The community's determination and unity became the greatest motivation for Jacob to press forward. Finally, after days of hearings, the trial reached its conclusion. Jacob stood, his gaze resolute, addressing the jury. "We are not only prosecuting a man, we are prosecuting a system, a mindset that believes power can rise above justice. Mr. Marcus Brooks became a victim of abuse of power, and we demand justice for him, for his family, and for the entire community." The jury listened intently, then retired to deliberate. The waiting period seemed endless, each minute intensifying the tension and anticipation among the community inside and outside the courtroom. When the jury returned, the atmosphere in the room froze. Everyone held their breath. As the verdict was read, Roger Ebert found guilty of assault and other misconduct. The courtroom erupted in cheers and tears of relief. Those present were not only celebrating justice for Marcus, but also the beginning of real change. Outside the courthouse, chants and cheers echoed as the community shared in the joy of justice finally being served. After the trial, Jacob stepped outside to meet the hundreds of townspeople waiting. He felt the fatigue from months of intense work, but also a deep pride and determination for a new journey ahead. Addressing the crowd, Jacob declared, "This is only the first step. We will not stop here. Reforms are coming, and we will ensure this system protects justice for everyone, not those who abuse their power." His words were met with resounding applause. Hope for change spread throughout the community, and for the first time in years, people felt that their voices had been heard and their rights were being safeguarded. With this verdict, Jacob and the community had achieved a significant victory, but they knew the journey ahead was long. Systemic reforms needed to be initiated, and rebuilding the community's trust in law enforcement would require time and effort. Jacob and his team began planning and establishing new guidelines to protect citizens' rights and prevent future police violence. In the months that followed, the town's police department began implementing reforms under strict supervision. New officers were carefully selected, use of force guidelines tightened, and ethics and human rights training programs introduced. Under Jacob's oversight, each small change gradually restored the people's trust. The fight for justice for Marcus had sparked a wave of change, not only for the town but also as a symbol for other communities across the nation. With renewed faith in justice, the community found strength and unity to move forward, building a fairer and more transparent system. When Jacob returned to the hospital to visit his father, Marcus was still in bed, yet to regain consciousness but showing signs of recovery. Jacob held his father's hand and whispered, "Dad, we did it. Justice was served, and I will keep my promise to continue fighting for the system you always hoped for." At that moment, Jacob knew this was not the end, but the beginning of the justice his father and the community deserved. Spring returned, bringing fresh, bright air to the small town, a sign of hope after long, tense days. Jacob continued to work tirelessly, immersed in meetings, reform proposals, and hearings with the police department to ensure that what happened to his father would never happen to anyone else. But no matter how busy he was, each evening he made time to visit the hospital and sit by his father, Marcus Brooks. Marcus lay quietly in his hospital bed, thinner than before, but the heroic spirit that Jacob remembered so vividly never faded from his mind. Sitting by his father, Jacob often told him about progress in his work and about the townspeople who had stood up bravely to defend justice. These stories were not only to soothe himself, but also a way for Jacob to keep faith that one day his father would wake up and witness the changes he had fought so hard to bring about. One quiet night, as Jacob sat holding his father's hand, he felt a small movement. At first, he thought he might have imagined it, but looking closely, he saw Marcus's fingers stir slightly. His heart pounded, his eyes wide with emotion and disbelief. He whispered, "Dad, can you hear me?" At that moment, Marcus's eyes slowly opened, meeting Jacob's tear-streaked face. Though his gaze was weak, it held the familiar glint of a man who had weathered many storms. His lips moved, and though his voice was faint, he managed to say a few words of encouragement to Jacob. "Son, you've done so well. Don't stop, Jacob. You've made me proud." Marcus's words, brief and fragile, felt like a new breath of life, bringing Jacob renewed strength. Unable to hold back his emotions, tears rolled down his face, filled with joy and relief. He held his father's hand tightly and whispered, "Dad, I'll never stop. We started this fight together, and I'll see it through to the end." The next day, news of Marcus's recovery quickly spread. More than just Jacob's beloved father, Marcus had become a symbol of strength and hope for the entire town. Those who had marched in the protests, who had chanted his name over the past months, felt they were part of this victory, and his recovery was a beacon of hope in the journey toward justice. As Marcus began making small strides in recovery, he grew stronger each day. Even the doctors were surprised at his resilience. For Marcus, though still weak, he understood that he had to fight to return, not just for himself, but for his son and the community that had placed its faith in him. Town residents often visited him in the hospital, bringing messages of encouragement, letters, and flowers, symbols of their gratitude and hope. In his lucid moments, Marcus looked at Jacob with pride. He often spoke to his son about the importance of patience and loyalty to justice. "Son," he whispered one time, his eyes bright, "never lose faith in what you're doing. I'm proud of you because you fought not only for me but for this whole town. This is a fight for all of us." Jacob responded with a heartfelt smile. "Dad, I'm only continuing the path you taught me. You taught me integrity and courage, and I'll never forget that." He knew that every word his father spoke was a powerful encouragement, strengthening his resolve in the journey to reform and rebuild trust. Thanks to Jacob's efforts and pressure from the community, police reforms were implemented swiftly. The police force was now retrained rigorously, with programs on ethics, humane handling of situations, and adherence to the law. The guidelines on the use of force were tightened, and a transparent oversight system was established to ensure every police action was monitored openly, leaving no room for hidden acts of violence. The protests outside the police department gradually transformed into active community meetings. Discussions and input from citizens were taken seriously, and Jacob, along with community leaders, worked tirelessly to listen and respond to their concerns. The town's unity had become a symbol of courage and belief in justice, and the story of Marcus and Jacob spread widely, inspiring other communities to fight for their rights. The day Marcus was discharged from the hospital was a special day not only for his family, but for the entire town. People from all over gathered at the hospital, welcoming him with applause and hopeful smiles. The crowd chanted his name, expressing their gratitude and pride for the man who had become a symbol of enduring struggle. Marcus stepped out of the hospital, hand in hand with Jacob, looking at the crowd with tearful eyes. He felt the love and gratitude from the community, and in that moment he understood he was not just a survivor, but a beacon of hope for a better justice system. He smiled, weak but proud, and spoke to the crowd. "Thank you all for not giving up. Thank you for standing up, not just for me, but for everyone without a voice. We've proven that when we stand together, we can make miracles happen." The applause roared like thunder, and at that moment the town seemed to unite as one, a community full of courage, determination, and faith in the future. Jacob stood beside his father, his heart filled with pride and hope. The battle he and his father had endured together had created change not only for this town but also as a light for other places where justice remained distant. Looking at his father, Jacob knew their journey wasn't over. The reforms were only the first steps, and restoring public trust would be a long-term task. But he also knew that, with his father's support, the community's backing, and those who had stood beside him, they would never stop. The values his father instilled, integrity, patience, and an unwavering will to fight, would guide him forward on the path they had started together. In the twilight, Marcus and Jacob walked away from the hospital, down the town's sunlit street. It was more than just a path. It was a road of hope, of change, and of faith in a brighter future. With Marcus's recovery, the entire town seemed to awaken, stepping into a new era full of hope and determination for change. Marcus was no longer a victim. He had become a living symbol of strength and courage. People who once lived in apathy or fear were now more united than ever, standing up boldly for justice and a belief in a fair future. Jacob knew that his struggle was still long and complex, but now he was no longer fighting alone. The community stood firmly behind him, a solid and inspiring support. In the early days, as Marcus's story spread, many townspeople showed their support through protests and marches. But as justice began to be served and the system started implementing small reforms, public support didn't wane. It only grew stronger. Those who had remained silent, or who had never before participated in community activism, found their voices. They began attending town meetings, expressing their hopes and ideas for the reforms they desired. Jacob frequently attended these meetings, listening carefully to each proposal. He witnessed an incredible transformation within the community. People who once hesitated, who were afraid of authority, were now ready to speak the truth and demand fairness. In one town hall meeting, an elderly woman stood up, her voice trembling but resolute. "We've been silent for too long. We will no longer live in fear. We want a system that truly protects our children and grandchildren." Her words echoed through the room and met with strong approval from everyone. The story of Marcus and Jacob's perseverance sparked a sense of responsibility in every resident, both for themselves and for the community. Those who had been victims of police violence or other injustices also found the courage to share their stories, creating a powerful wave of demand for change. Those who once suffered in silence had now become active advocates, calling for accountability and transparency from the system. Jacob and community leaders didn't stop there. They began pushing for extensive reforms in the police force and judicial system. Training sessions on human rights, nonviolent conflict resolution, and professional ethics were organized. New training required officers to learn how to listen to and respect the citizens they were meant to protect. Jacob also established an independent oversight committee comprised of community representatives and legal experts to monitor and review cases involving police violence or misconduct. The reform process brought its challenges. Some police officers and officials resisted the changes, arguing that the new regulations would weaken their power and influence. They attempted to obstruct Jacob's plans, spreading rumors or pressuring those who supported him. But for Jacob, these were just obstacles on the path he had chosen. He remained steadfast, pushing forward with the reforms to build a fairer and more transparent system. Outside, the community continued to rally behind Jacob. Marches, discussions, and public forums attracted more and more people from all backgrounds, not only from the town but also from nearby areas. They came to share their stories, learn from the reforms Jacob's town had achieved, and seek change within their communities. Marcus's image, a man who had fallen to injustice but recovered to become a symbol of resilience, inspired courage and hope for countless others. At a Friday evening community meeting, Marcus made an appearance, even though his health was still fragile. Standing before the crowd, he wore a warm smile and had a determined look in his eyes. As he began to speak, the hall fell silent, everyone hanging on his every word. "There was a time I thought I wouldn't make it, but thanks to all of you, my son, and a belief in justice, I am here today. We must stay united. We cannot let what happened to me happen to anyone else." Marcus's words were like a flame of inspiration, setting off applause and shouts of support throughout the room. People no longer felt isolated or abandoned by a system in which they had lost faith. Now they were part of the change, taking control of their future. Jacob looked at his father, feeling his heart swell with pride and determination to continue the fight he had begun. News of the reforms in Jacob's town started to spread. Other communities reached out to learn from their example, and national media took an interest in the story of Marcus and Jacob. Interviews, articles, and television programs depicted their struggle as a symbol of courage and perseverance. Their story became an inspiration, proof that even in small towns, people could create change if they stood together. Though they had achieved initial successes, Jacob understood that the fight was far from over. The reforms he and the community had pushed for were only the first steps, and much more needed to be done to ensure that these wrongdoings wouldn't happen again. Jacob and his colleagues continued working with legislators to establish long-term legal protections, while also urging other police forces to adopt ethical and human rights standards. Jacob frequently updated the community on each step of progress, encouraging everyone to maintain faith and keep striving to protect justice. In the end, the small town of Marcus and Jacob became a model for other communities across the country. The reforms they promoted not only changed the police system, but also transformed how people viewed and interacted with their government. Their unity and courage sparked hope that anyone, any community, could fight for justice and fairness. After returning home from a long meeting, Jacob sat beside his father, and the two looked out over the road in front of their house, a road that once symbolized fear and indifference but now radiated hope and belief. Marcus gently placed his hand on Jacob's shoulder, his voice warm. "Son, you've changed this place forever. I'm proud of you, not only for what you've done for me, but for fighting for all of us." Jacob nodded, his heart full of resolve, knowing that no matter how difficult it might be, he would never stop fighting. The road ahead was still long, but now, with his father by his side and a strong community at his back, he believed they could build a brighter and more just future. In the lightened atmosphere following the great changes in the community, Jacob knew that the justice he and his father had fought for was not just about prosecuting and punishing wrongdoers. It was a long journey toward healing wounds, rebuilding trust, and kindling hope for a future where everyone could live in fairness and without fear. More than anyone, Jacob understood that this fight was not about revenge, but a steadfast commitment to a better, more transparent society. The story of Marcus had transcended the bounds of a small town, becoming a symbol of unity and the power of justice. In interviews and speeches, Jacob emphasized that building a fair and transparent system was not just the responsibility of lawmakers, but of everyone. Every individual, no matter how big or small, could contribute to the fight for a fairer world by daring to stand up and speak out against wrongdoing. One evening, before hundreds of townspeople gathered in the main square, Jacob stood to speak, his voice ringing out through the quiet space, touching every heart. "Our journey is not over. What we have achieved is not just a victory for Marcus, but a victory for each of us. To ensure that justice truly exists, we must build a system together where misconduct is not tolerated, where everyone is protected, and where no one has to live in fear." The townspeople listened, feeling the strength in each of Jacob's words. They understood that they were no longer isolated individuals but a closely bonded community. The story of Marcus, Jacob's courageous father, inspired them to recognize the power of unity and courage. Those who had once been silent witnesses had now become warriors for justice. With this change, Jacob began planning long-term measures to ensure that the reforms would not remain confined to one small town but would spread across the region. He worked with leaders from neighboring areas, advocating for collaboration in establishing ethical standards and thorough training for police officers. The new principles required officers not only to obey the law, but also encouraged them to carry out their duties with compassion and responsibility. These changes were not only meant to prevent misconduct, but also to ensure that every officer understood and respected their mission. Under Jacob's leadership, an independent oversight committee was established, with representatives from all parts of the community, including teachers, doctors, and social activists. They monitored police activities to ensure every incident was handled fairly and transparently. Those who had been victims of violence and injustice were now encouraged to share their stories, contributing to a better system for future generations. Over time, hope for a fair future spread widely within the community. People not only felt safer, but also proud of their role in such a significant change. Younger generations looked at the story of Marcus and Jacob as a testament to courage and belief in justice. They learned not to be afraid, to speak up, and to fight for their rights, with the faith that injustice could be defeated if everyone stood united. Marcus, now almost fully recovered, continually thanked Jacob and the community for never giving up. He often spoke at gatherings, meeting with young people and inspiring them about the importance of perseverance and justice. During one conversation with young people at a school, he said, "We cannot choose our fate, but we can choose how we face it. When we refuse to give up, when we stand up for what's right, that is when we truly own our lives." Marcus's words became a guiding principle for many, helping them realize their self-worth and the hidden strength within them. The community was no longer just a collection of isolated individuals, but had become a united force, ready to stand up for justice, no matter the challenges. For Jacob, the fight for justice was not only the mission of a citizen, but also his commitment to his father and to all the people who had placed their trust in him. Though many achievements had been made, he understood that new challenges would always arise and that those wanting to return to the old ways would try to obstruct progress. But with an unwavering determination, Jacob committed to continuing his work for a transparent system and a fair society. One weekend, as he and Marcus sat together in a small cafe, watching people pass by, Marcus held his son's hand, his eyes shining with pride and emotion. "Jacob, you haven't just changed my life. You've changed an entire community. I know this journey will never be easy, but I believe you'll never stop." Jacob smiled, his eyes bright with hope. "Dad, I promise you that I'll keep fighting, not just for you, but for everyone in this community. I won't stop until justice is truly upheld." And so, the story closed, but the fight for justice and the dawn of new hope had just begun. Jacob, with the support of his father and the community, had committed to creating a system where no one would have to live in fear, where justice was not just a word but a guiding principle. Their story would remain an inspiration, a beacon for those who dare to stand up and fight for what is right, with a fierce belief that a fair society is something everyone deserves. Finally, justice triumphed as the son of a veteran relentlessly brought the truth to light and held the perpetrator accountable. Do you believe that persistence can lead to profound change? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to spread more stories of justice and courage. See you next time.
The morning sun had barely risen over Metro City when Officer Sarah Bennett began her patrol shift on what seemed like an ordinary Tuesday. Her polished badge gleamed against her dark blue uniform as she adjusted her rear-view mirror, catching a glimpse of her stern expression. At 38, Bennett had built a reputation in the department for having the highest arrest record in her precinct, though her methods often raised eyebrows among her colleagues. The convenience store at the corner of Maple and 5th Street was already bustling with its usual morning crowd. Among them was Marcus Thompson, a 17-year-old high school senior known in the neighborhood for his kindness and volunteer work. That morning, like many others, he had stopped by to help Mrs. Wilson, an 82-year-old regular customer who struggled with her weekly grocery shopping. "Let me help you with those bags, Mrs. Wilson," Marcus said warmly, carefully placing her groceries in her rolling cart. The store's security cameras captured his gentle assistance, showing him reaching for items on high shelves and ensuring the elderly woman's comfort. Mrs. Wilson patted his hand affectionately. "You're such a blessing, Marcus. Your mother raised you right." She smiled, her wrinkled face beaming with gratitude. The store owner, Mr. Patel, watched from behind the counter, nodding in approval. Marcus had been helping elderly customers for the past 2 years, never asking for anything in return. Outside, Officer Bennett's patrol car slowed to a crawl as she spotted Marcus exiting the store. Her eyes narrowed, and a slight smirk crossed her face. She had received a vague report about a robbery suspect in the area, a young black male in a red hoodie. Marcus, wearing a burgundy school sweatshirt, became her immediate target. Without warning, Bennett swung her patrol car into the parking lot, lights flashing. She jumped out, hand already on her weapon. "Don't move," she shouted, causing several customers to freeze in their tracks. Marcus, confused and frightened, raised his hand slowly. "Officer, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice trembling but clear. Mrs. Wilson, still standing nearby, clutched her cart in shock. Bennett ignored the elderly woman's presence completely. "Shut up and turn around. You match the description of a robbery suspect," she barked, roughly grabbing Marcus's arms and cuffing him. The metal bracelets clicked shut around his wrists as nearby shoppers began pulling out their phones to record the incident. "But I didn't do anything," Marcus protested, his voice cracking with fear and disbelief. "Ask Mrs. Wilson. I was just helping her with her groceries." Mrs. Wilson stepped forward, her voice shaking with anger. "Officer, this young man was helping me. He's done nothing wrong." Bennett dismissed the elderly woman with a wave of her hand. "Ma'am, stay back. This is police business." Her voice carried a tone of superiority and disdain. Mr. Paddle rushed out of his store, waving his arms. "Officer, there's been a mistake. Marcus is a regular here. We have security footage of everything." But Bennett wasn't interested in explanations. She seemed almost pleased with herself as she roughly guided Marcus toward her patrol car. Unknown to her, Marcus's phone in his pocket was still running the voice memo app he'd been using earlier to record his grandmother's cherry pie recipe. As she pushed him into the back seat, Bennett allowed herself a small, satisfied laugh. The sound was captured perfectly on Marcus's phone, along with her muttered comments that would later send shockwaves through the courtroom. Inside the store, Mr. Patel was already pulling up the security footage while Mrs. Wilson called Marcus's mother, Patricia Thompson. Patricia, a respected paralegal at Harrison and Meyer law firm, felt her heart drop as she listened to Mrs. Wilson's frantic explanation. "Stay calm, Mrs. Wilson," Patricia said, her voice steady despite her rising anger. "I'm calling our attorney right now. Please send me the security footage as soon as you can." As Bennett's patrol car pulled away from the convenience store, she was completely unaware that her actions had been captured from multiple angles: the store's security cameras, bystanders' phones, and most importantly, Marcus's own audio recording. Her moment of perceived triumph would soon transform into the catalyst for her downfall. The morning sun now hung higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty parking spot where Marcus had stood just moments before. Mrs. Wilson wiped tears from her eyes as she watched the patrol car disappear around the corner, while Mr. Patel methodically backed up the security footage that would soon become crucial evidence in a case that would shake the entire police department to its core. The fluorescent lights of the police precinct buzzed overhead as Officer Bennett marched Marcus through the station's hallways. Her boots clicked against the polished floor, echoing through the corridors as other officers looked up from their desks. Marcus walked silently, his head held high despite his trembling hands, while his phone continued recording in his pocket. "Look what I caught this morning," Bennett announced proudly to her colleagues, pushing Marcus toward the booking area. Officer James Rodriguez glanced up from his paperwork, his forehead creasing with concern as he observed the young man's school uniform and bewildered expression. "What's the charge, Bennett?" Rodriguez asked, his tone careful and measured. He had worked with Bennett long enough to recognize her patterns, though he'd always kept his doubts to himself. Bennett's laugh echoed through the room. "Armed robbery suspect. Matched the description perfectly." She gestured toward Marcus with a dismissive wave. "Found him skulking around outside Miller's convenience store." "I was helping an elderly lady with her groceries," Marcus spoke up, his voice steady despite his fear. "There are witnesses, security cameras." "Shut it," Bennett snapped, her face hardening. She turned to her colleagues with a knowing smirk. "They always have excuses, don't they?" In the break room adjacent to booking, Bennett's voice carried clearly as she joked with Officer Thompson, unaware that every word was being captured by Marcus's phone. "Finally caught one that'll stick," she boasted, pouring herself coffee. "These kids think they can get away with anything these days." Meanwhile, across town, Patricia Thompson sat in the office of civil rights attorney James Washington, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. Mrs. Wilson and Mr. Patel had already sent over the security footage, which played silently on Washington's computer screen. "This is a clear case of racial profiling," Washington said, his eyes fixed on the footage showing Marcus helping Mrs. Wilson. "But we need more evidence to prove a pattern of behavior." Patricia's phone buzzed with a text from her colleague at the courthouse. "They're processing him now," she said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "James, my son has never been in trouble a day in his life. He volunteers at the senior center, maintains a 3.8 GPA. Back at the precinct, Bennett was filling out her arrest report, embellishing details with practiced ease. Subject exhibited suspicious behavior, attempted to flee, resisted arrest. She muttered as she typed, each false word adding to her narrative. Officer Rodriguez watched from his desk, his discomfort growing. He had seen this scenario play out before, but something felt different this time. The young man's demeanor, his school uniform, the way Bennett was almost gleeful about the arrest, it all felt wrong. In the holding cell, Marcus sat quietly, remembering his mother's words about staying calm in situations like this. He knew his phone was still recording, capturing every sound, every comment, every laugh that echoed through the precinct halls. "Hey, Bennett," called Officer Miller from across the room. "What about that robbery report? Got any details on the actual suspect?" Bennett hesitated for a split second before responding. "Dispatch said young black male, red hoodie. That's what we got." "Strange," Miller replied, checking his computer. "I don't see any robbery reports from this morning in that area." Bennett's expression flickered briefly before she shrugged it off. "Must be a delay in the system. You know how it gets sometimes." As the morning wore on, the precinct began buzzing with activity. Officers came and went. Paperwork shuffled across desks, and phones rang continuously. Through it all, Bennett's voice could be heard, growing more confident with each retelling of her successful arrest. What she didn't know was that Patricia Thompson had already set wheels in motion. The security footage was being enhanced, witness statements were being collected, and most importantly, Marcus's phone continued to record everything: the casual racism, the fabricated details, the proud laughter. By early afternoon, Attorney Washington had already filed an emergency hearing request. The security footage was clear, the witness statements were strong, and unknown to Bennett, her own words would soon become the most damaging evidence against her. As the sun began to set outside the precinct windows, Bennett prepared to end her shift, satisfied with her day's work. She had no idea that in less than 24 hours, her entire world would be turned upside down in a courtroom where the truth would finally come to light. Patricia Thompson's heels clicked purposefully across the marble floor of Harrison and Meyer law firm, where she had worked as a paralegal for the past 15 years. Her colleague, Attorney James Washington, woke beside her as they entered the firm's main conference room. Spread across the large mahogany table were pieces of evidence they had gathered in the mere hours since Marcus's arrest. "Look at this timestamp," Washington said, pointing to the security footage from Miller's convenience store. The crystal-clear video showed Marcus helping Mrs. Wilson at 8:47 a.m., and here's the dispatch log for the entire morning. He slid another document forward. There wasn't a single robbery reported in that district. Patricia nodded, her hands steady as she organized the growing pile of evidence. "Mr. Paddle sent over footage from the past 3 months," she said, pulling up additional videos on her laptop. It shows Marcus helping seniors every Tuesday and Thursday morning before school. He's been doing this as part of his community service project. The door opened, and Mrs. Wilson entered, supported by her daughter. Despite her age, the elderly woman's eyes burned with determination. "I've known Marcus since he was a child," she stated firmly, lowering herself into a chair. "That officer, she wouldn't even look at me when I tried to explain." Washington pressed play on Marcus's phone recording, which had been retrieved when he was finally released on his own recognizance. Bennett's voice filled the room, clear and damning. "These kids think they can get away with anything these days," followed by her distinctive laugh. The recording continues for nearly 2 hours. Patricia explained, her voice tight with controlled anger. She made multiple racist comments, admitted to other officers there was no actual robbery report, and even joked about making the charges stick. In another part of the city, Officer Rodriguez sat in his apartment, wrestling with his conscience. He had witnessed Bennett's behavior for years but had always stayed quiet. Now, staring at his phone with Washington's business card in his hand, he knew he had to make a choice. Back at the law firm, Washington's team had discovered a pattern. "We found 15 similar arrests by Bennett in the past year alone," a young associate reported, spreading out the files. "All young black males, all charges eventually dropped, but the damage was already done." Patricia's phone buzzed, a text from Marcus. "Mom, I'm okay, but there was another kid in the holding cell. Said Officer Bennett did the same thing to him last month." Washington nodded grimly. We're building a solid case. Bennett's body camera footage from yesterday should be the final piece we need. But when they requested the footage, the department claimed it was malfunctioning during the arrest. This only strengthened their case about Bennett's premeditation. Mrs. Wilson's daughter, a social media consultant, had been busy too. The community is rallying behind Marcus, she reported, showing them her phone. 3 different angles of the arrest have gone viral. People are sharing stories about Bennett's previous encounters. As evening approached, Rodriguez finally made his decision. He dialed Washington's number. I need to meet with you, he said quietly. There's more you should know about Officer Bennett. Patricia watched as Washington took the call, hope rising in her chest. They had gathered more evidence in one day than most cases saw in a month. Security footage, audio recordings, witness statements, pattern documentation, and now a potential whistleblower from within the department. The emergency hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning, Washington announced, ending the call. Judge Hawthorne is presiding. She has a strong record on civil rights cases. Mrs. Wilson reached across the table and squeezed Patricia's hand. We'll make this right, she said firmly. That officer won't be able to hurt any more children. As the team prepared to leave for the day, Patricia received one more text from Marcus. Mom, remember what you always told me about standing up for what's right. That's what we're doing now, isn't it? Patricia showed the message to Washington, who smiled for the first time that day. Your son, he said, is going to help us change things around here. Outside the law firm's windows, the sun was setting on a day that had started with injustice but would end with hope. Tomorrow, in Judge Hawthorne's courtroom, Officer Sarah Bennett would learn that her badge didn't make her above the law, and that sometimes justice comes from the very people you tried to silence. The courthouse buzzed with tension as Judge Hawthorne's courtroom filled to capacity. Officer Bennett sat at the prosecution table, her uniform pressed and badge gleaming, projecting an air of confidence. She barely glanced at Marcus and his family as they entered with Attorney Washington. All rise, the bailiff called out as Judge Hawthorne entered, her stern expression surveying the packed courtroom. The morning sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Your Honor, Bennett's department lawyer began. Officer Bennett had reasonable suspicion based on a reported robbery in the area. The suspect description matched. Objection, Your Honor. Washington interrupted, rising from his seat. There was no robbery report filed that morning. We have the complete dispatch logs. Judge Hawthorne's eyes narrowed. Officer Bennett, please take the stand. Bennett strode to the witness box, swearing her oath with practiced ease. Her voice remained steady as she began her testimony, recounting her version of the morning's events. I observed the suspect. The student, Judge Hawthorne corrected firmly. The student, Bennett continued, adjusting her collar, exhibiting suspicious behavior outside Miller's convenience store. Based on my 12 years of experience and training. In the gallery, Mrs. Wilson shook her head in disbelief, clutching her handbag tightly. Mr. Patel, who had closed his store to attend the hearing, scribbled notes furiously. And your body camera footage from this incident? Judge Hawthorne inquired. Unfortunately malfunctioning that morning, Your Honor, Bennett's lawyer quickly interjected. How convenient, the judge remarked dryly. Officer Bennett, in your 12 years of service, how many times has your body camera malfunctioned during an arrest? Bennett shifted in her seat. I don't recall exactly. Washington stood, holding a folder. Your Honor, we have documentation of 17 malfunctions in the past year alone, all during arrests of young black males. The courtroom murmured. Bennett's confident facade cracked slightly as she glanced at her lawyer. Officer Bennett, Washington approached the stand. Could you explain why you ignored Mrs. Wilson's attempts to tell you that Mr. Thompson was helping her with groceries? I was focused on securing a potential suspect, Bennett replied, her voice taking on a defensive edge. A suspect in a robbery that was never reported. Washington pressed. Before Bennett could respond, the courtroom doors opened. Officer Rodriguez slipped in, taking the seat in the back. Bennett's eyes widened slightly at the sight of her colleague. Your Honor, Washington continued, I'd like to play an audio recording from Mr. Thompson's phone, captured during his arrest and subsequent detention. Bennett's face paled as her own voice filled the courtroom, her laughter, her comments, her admissions to colleagues. The recording was crystal clear, leaving no room for denial or explanation. Furthermore, Washington added, Officer Rodriguez has provided a written statement regarding Officer Bennett's history of targeting young black males and fabricating probable cause. Bennett's lawyer jumped up. Objection. This is hearsay. Officer Rodriguez is present and prepared to testify, Your Honor, Washington countered. Judge Hawthorne leaned forward. Officer Bennett, would you care to explain these recordings? Bennett's composure finally cracked. Your Honor, in my experience, certain demographics are more likely to stop. Judge Hawthorne's voice cut through the air like a knife. Are you actually attempting to justify racial profiling in my courtroom? The silence that followed was deafening. Patricia Thompson squeezed her son's hand as they watched Bennett's professional demeanor crumble under the weight of her exposed prejudice. Your Honor, Washington spoke again, we have evidence of a pattern of similar incidents. Officer Bennett's actions show a clear bias and abuse of authority. Judge Hawthorne studied the documents before her, then looked directly at Bennett. Officer, in all your years of service, did you ever consider that your badge was meant to protect and serve everyone equally? Bennett sat silently, her earlier confidence replaced by visible discomfort as the truth of her actions was laid bare in the harsh light of justice. The morning sun had climbed higher now, its rays illuminating the truth that Bennett had tried so hard to hide. In the gallery, Marcus sat tall, surrounded by supporters, watching as the officer who had laughed at his arrest faced the consequences of her actions. The preliminary hearing wasn't over, but already the scales of justice were beginning to tip. The courtroom atmosphere grew even more intense as Washington approached the evidence table, lifting Marcus's phone with latex gloves. Your Honor, with your permission, we'd like to play the complete audio recording from Mr. Thompson's phone. Judge Hawthorne nodded. Proceed. The first sounds filled the courtroom, the gentle conversation between Marcus and Mrs. Wilson at the store, his polite offers to help, her grateful responses. Then came Bennett's harsh voice, the false accusations, and most damningly, her conversation at the precinct. Bennett shifted uncomfortably in her seat as her own voice echoed through the speakers. Got another one. These kids need to learn their place. Followed by mocking laughter. Her face reddened as several jurors visibly recoiled at her words. Mr. Patel was the next witness called. He walked to the stand, straightening his tie nervously but speaking with clear conviction. Marcus comes to my store every Tuesday and Thursday morning. For 2 years, he has helped elderly customers with their shopping. I have all the footage. Washington played the security videos on the courtroom screens. Crystal clear footage showed Marcus's regular visits, his consistent helpfulness, and most importantly, the morning of his arrest. The timestamp clearly showed no suspicious behavior, only a young man helping an elderly woman with her groceries. And Officer Bennett, Washington asked, did she ask to see this footage? No, sir, Mr. Patel replied firmly. She refused to look at it. She wouldn't even come into the store when I called out to her. Mrs. Wilson took the stand next, her voice trembling with anger rather than age. I tried to tell that officer that Marcus was helping me. She acted like I was invisible, like my words meant nothing. Officer Rodriguez's testimony followed, his voice steady despite the obvious discomfort of testifying against a fellow officer. Bennett had a pattern. She would target young black males, especially in that neighborhood. She would laugh about it in the break room, brag about her arrest numbers. As Rodriguez spoke, Bennett's lawyer frantically scribbled notes, but the damage was already done. The evidence was overwhelming, and Bennett's earlier confidence had completely evaporated. Your Honor, Washington continued, we have also obtained records of Officer Bennett's arrest history. He distributed documents to the court. In the past year alone, 92% of her discretionary arrests involved young black males. Of those arrests, 85% were eventually dismissed for lack of probable cause. Judge Hawthorne studied the statistics, her expression growing darker. Officer Bennett, she said, looking directly at the police officer, would you care to explain these numbers? Bennett cleared her throat. Your Honor, I was simply responding to suspicious activity in high-crime areas. High-crime areas? Washington interrupted, presenting another document. The neighborhood where Mr. Thompson was arrested has one of the lowest crime rates in the city. The only spike in arrests comes from your shifts, Officer Bennett. The evidence continued to mount. Community members testified about similar encounters with Bennett. Former arrestees described identical patterns of behavior. With each testimony, Bennett seemed to shrink further into her chair. The final piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. A young rookie officer, inspired by Rodriguez's courage, had come forward with cell phone footage from the precinct break room. The video showed Bennett bragging about her arrests, making racially charged jokes, and admitting to targeting specific neighborhoods. Your Honor, Washington said, standing at his full height, the pattern is clear. Officer Bennett has systematically abused her authority, violated civil rights, and engaged in racial profiling. Her actions have traumatized innocent citizens and undermined public trust in law enforcement. Marcus sat with his mother, watching as the truth unfolded. The same officer who had laughed while arresting him now looked small and defeated, her badge no longer gleaming quite so brightly. Judge Hawthorne's voice cut through the tension. Officer Bennett, in my 20 years on the bench, I have seen many cases of police misconduct. But the level of documented evidence here, the clear pattern of bias, and most disturbing, your apparent pleasure in abusing your authority. She paused, letting her words sink in. This court cannot and will not ignore such a flagrant violation of civil rights. The sun had shifted in the courtroom windows, but no one moved. They all knew they were witnessing a moment of justice that would reshape their community. Bennett's day of reckoning had finally arrived, and her laughter had been replaced by the sound of justice in motion. Judge Hawthorne's courtroom had fallen into complete silence as the technical expert from the police department's Internal Affairs Division took the stand. He carried a laptop containing the recovered footage from the precinct's security cameras, footage that Bennett didn't know existed. Please explain what we're about to see, Judge Hawthorne instructed, her voice carrying through the hushed courtroom. The expert adjusted his glasses. These are recordings from the precinct's internal security system, taken the morning of Marcus Thompson's arrest. The system automatically backs up to a secure server every hour. As the footage began playing on the courtroom screens, Bennett's face turned ashen. There she was, leading Marcus through the precinct hallway, but the angle showed something her earlier testimony had denied. Marcus walking calmly, following all instructions, showing no resistance. Stop the video there, Washington requested. Officer Bennett, you testified earlier that Mr. Thompson was combative and resistant. Could you explain this discrepancy? Bennett's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Her lawyer leaned over to whisper something, but she barely seemed to hear him. The footage continued. The audio was clear enough to capture every word of Bennett's conversations with her colleagues. Her laughter echoed through the courtroom speakers as she bragged about the arrest, made racial comments, and admitted there had been no robbery report. Your Honor, the technical expert continued, we also recovered deleted text messages from Officer Bennett's department-issued phone. He pulled up another screen. These messages show a pattern of coordination with certain officers to target specific neighborhoods and demographics. Patricia Thompson watched as her son's wrongful arrest unfolded from yet another angle. The evidence was overwhelming, but what struck everyone in the courtroom was Bennett's obvious enjoyment of the situation, her smiles, her laughter, her casual cruelty. Officer Rodriguez, still seated in the gallery, shook his head slowly. He had seen this behavior before, but watching it played back in the formal setting of the courtroom made it even more disturbing. Furthermore, the expert continued, we found that Officer Bennett's body camera didn't malfunction that morning. It was manually disabled approximately 2 minutes before Mr. Thompson's arrest. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Judge Hawthorne's gaze sharpened. Manually disabled? Yes, Your Honor. The system logs show it was intentionally turned off and then reported as malfunctioning after the fact. Bennett's lawyer stood up, desperately trying to salvage the situation. Your Honor, perhaps we could take a brief recess to review this new evidence. But Judge Hawthorne wasn't finished. Officer Bennett approached the bench. Bennett rose on shaky legs, her earlier arrogance completely gone. As she stood before the judge, the courtroom screen still showed her laughing face from the precinct footage, a stark contrast to her current demeanor. Officer Bennett, Judge Hawthorne's voice was measured but stern. In all my years on the bench, I have seen many troubling cases. But rarely have I seen such a clear display of prejudice, abuse of power, and, most disturbingly, enjoyment of that abuse. The judge lifted another document. I have here a report showing that your precinct received implicit bias training just 3 months ago. You signed an acknowledgement of completion. Yet here you are, not only displaying that bias but celebrating it. Mrs. Wilson, still seated in the gallery, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Mr. Patel reached over to pat her shoulder consolingly. They'd all watched as Bennett stood before the judge, her uniform no longer carrying the authority it had just hours ago. Your Honor, Bennett finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I can explain. I believe you've explained enough. Judge Hawthorne interrupted, gesturing to the screen still showing the precinct footage. Your actions, your words, and most importantly, your laughter have made your position quite clear. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courtroom floor as justice prepared to take its course. Marcus sat straight-backed beside his mother, watching the officer who had humiliated him now facing her own moment of reckoning. Judge Hawthorne shuffled her papers, preparing to deliver her decision. The courtroom held its collective breath, knowing that whatever came next would send ripples through the entire police department and beyond. Bennett's day of laughing at injustice was about to come to an end. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters as Attorney Washington presented the statistical evidence his team had gathered over the past 48 hours. Behind him stood Marcus, his mother, and a group of previous victims of Officer Bennett's discriminatory practices. The numbers tell a disturbing story, Washington announced, holding up a thick report. Over the past 3 years, Officer Bennett has arrested 238 young black males. Of these arrests, 204 were dismissed due to lack of probable cause. But what's more troubling is what we found in the department's own data. Inside the courtroom, Judge Hawthorne reviewed the comprehensive analysis. Charts and graphs showed a clear pattern. Bennett's arrest rate skyrocketed on the first of every month, coinciding with the department's performance reviews. Your Honor, the police department's data analyst testified, Officer Bennett's arrest patterns show statistically impossible disparities. In areas with diverse populations, her discretionary arrests targeted black males 97% of the time. The evidence continued to mount. Former arrestees came forward, their stories eerily similar to Marcus's experience. Each described Bennett's distinctive laugh, her dismissal of witnesses, her fabricated probable cause. We've also discovered concerning financial patterns, Washington continued, presenting bank records. Officer Bennett received performance bonuses based on her arrest numbers. She was literally profiting from these discriminatory arrests. Bennett's lawyer slumped in his chair as more documents were entered into evidence. Text messages between Bennett and other officers revealed casual discussions about targeting specific neighborhoods and demographics. Email threads showed her bragging about her arrest quotas and joking about her methods. Officer Rodriguez returned to the stand, now with additional documentation. After my initial testimony, other officers came forward. They provided these internal messages showing Officer Bennett coaching newer officers on how to circumvent probable cause requirements. The police chief, summoned by the court, sat uncomfortably as he reviewed the evidence. His department's oversight failures were becoming increasingly apparent. Chief, Judge Hawthorne addressed him directly. How did these patterns go unnoticed for so long? Your Honor, he began, tugging at his collar, we're implementing new oversight procedures. That doesn't answer my question, the judge interrupted sharply. Patricia Thompson watched from her seat, her paralegal training allowing her to understand the full implications of each new piece of evidence. The case had grown beyond her son's wrongful arrest into an exposure of systemic issues. The courtroom screens displayed a map of the city, with red dots indicating Bennett's arrests over the past 3 years. The pattern was undeniable, concentrated entirely in predominantly black neighborhoods, even when crime rates were higher in other areas. Furthermore, Washington continued, we've uncovered evidence that Officer Bennett actively avoided responding to calls in other neighborhoods, specifically to maintain her demographic arrest patterns. A young officer, recently graduated from the academy, provided testimony about Bennett's training sessions. Unofficial meetings where she taught new officers how to target specific individuals while avoiding departmental scrutiny. The police department's internal affairs investigator presented his findings next. We discovered that multiple complaints were filed against Officer Bennett over the years, but they were systematically buried or dismissed without proper investigation. As the afternoon wore on, the evidence painted a picture not just of individual bias, but of a system that had allowed it to flourish. Bennett sat at the defense table, no longer smirking, as her years of discriminatory practices were laid bare. Judge Hawthorne reviewed bodycam footage from other officers who had worked with Bennett, showing multiple instances of her laughing about arrests, making racial comments, and bragging about her tactics. The pattern is clear, Washington concluded. Officer Bennett didn't just engage in racial profiling. She turned it into a career advancement strategy, celebrated it with colleagues, and trained others to follow her example. Outside the courthouse, community activists gathered with signs demanding justice. Local news crews interviewed former arrestees who had come forward with their stories. The impact of Bennett's actions had rippled through the entire community. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the courtroom windows, Judge Hawthorne prepared to address the mounting evidence. The case had evolved from a single wrongful arrest into an exposure of deep-rooted problems within the police department. Bennett's laugh, once a symbol of impunity, had become the catalyst for change. Judge Hawthorne's chambers were silent as she prepared her final ruling. The evidence presented over the past days had transformed a single case of wrongful arrest into a landmark decision that would reshape the department's future. Standing before the packed courtroom, Judge Hawthorne's voice carried authority and purpose. After reviewing all evidence presented, this court finds overwhelming proof of systematic civil rights violations perpetrated by Officer Sarah Bennett. Bennett sat rigid in her chair, her badge now removed from her uniform, as the judge continued. The actions of Officer Bennett represent not just individual bias, but a calculated abuse of power that targeted and traumatized innocent citizens. This court orders the following. The judge lifted her written decision. First, all charges against Marcus Thompson are dismissed with prejudice. His record will be immediately expunged. Patricia squeezed her son's hand as tears of relief rolled down her cheeks. Second, Officer Sarah Bennett is hereby terminated from the police force, effective immediately. She is permanently barred from serving in any law enforcement capacity within this state. A murmur rippled through the courtroom as Bennett's head dropped. Third, a full Department of Justice civil rights investigation will be launched into the department's practices, oversight failures, and handling of complaints against Officer Bennett. The police chief shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Judge Hawthorne continued. Fourth, the court orders the immediate review of all arrests made by Officer Bennett over the past 3 years. All individuals wrongfully arrested will be eligible for compensation from a fund to be established by the city. Washington nodded in satisfaction as he made notes. Finally, the judge paused, making eye contact with Bennett. This court is referring this case to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution on multiple counts of civil rights violations, false imprisonment, and misconduct under color of authority. 2 court officers approached Bennett, who finally seemed to grasp the magnitude of her downfall. Her familiar laugh was nowhere to be heard as they led her away to process her arrest. Outside the courthouse, Marcus faced a crowd of reporters with dignity beyond his years. "This isn't just about me," he said clearly. "It's about every person who was wrongly targeted, every witness who was ignored, and every laugh that made us feel powerless." Patricia stepped forward to speak as well. Today, justice wasn't just served, it was transformed. This ruling shows that no badge can shield corruption, and no position of power is above the law. Mr. Patel and Mrs. Wilson stood nearby, their presence a testament to the community's role in exposing the truth. Officer Rodriguez, now assigned to help review Bennett's past cases, nodded respectfully as he passed them. The police chief held a press conference announcing immediate reforms. Mandatory body camera reviews, enhanced oversight procedures, and a new community review board. The changes came too late for Bennett's victims, but marked a starting point for departmental transformation. Later that evening, Marcus returned to Miller's convenience store with his mother. Mr. Patel greeted them with tears in his eyes and hugs. The security cameras that had helped prove his innocence still watched silently overhead. "Will you still help us seniors with our groceries?" Mrs. Wilson asked, having waited at the store to see him. Marcus smiled warmly. Every Tuesday and Thursday, just like always, we can't let fear change who we are or stop us from helping others. As they walked home in the fading light, Patricia noticed her son standing taller, stronger. The trauma of his arrest would take time to heal, but justice had given him something powerful, validation that his truth mattered. The story made national headlines. Officers' laugh leads to landmark police reform. Bennett's case became a teaching example in police academies across the country, demonstrating how bias, arrogance, and abuse of power could no longer hide behind a badge. In the years that followed, Marcus went on to law school, inspired by his experience to fight for justice. The convenience store became a symbol of community solidarity, and Mrs. Wilson proudly shared the story with anyone who would listen. And somewhere in a state prison, former officer Sarah Bennett had plenty of time to reflect on how her laugh of prejudice had transformed into a catalyst for change, proving that justice, though sometimes delayed, would not be denied. The case was closed, but its impact resonated far beyond the courthouse walls, reminding everyone that in the face of injustice, truth and community could prevail, one story at a time.